Welcome to Systems Change Finland's monthly Sensemaking meetups. So my name is Zeynep Falay von Pittner, and I will be your host today. In this monthly events, we explore topics related to applied systems thinking and complexity with interesting speakers. And today we have a very interesting speaker, my dear friend and Idil, which I will introduce a bit later. But before that, about some of you who may not know what is Systems Change Finland, and basically we are a non-profit organization and a community of experts, academics, interested people who seek to cultivate a society that can deal with systemic and complex challenges. And we are a volunteer-based organization, and feel free to join us. We organize this type of events where we can learn together. There are some reading clubs, there are some practice-based explorations, and definitely these meetups is one of the most interesting activities that's been going very strong first half of this year, and we hope to continue. Yes, so today's igniter, Dr. Idil Ulusoy. She's professor of sustainable design at Aalto University and leader of Nodus Sustainable Design Research Group. She's a sustainability scientist and design researcher, which is quite an unusual combination, rare to find, but very much needed. She's developing a teaching and research portfolio for imagining sustainable, equitable, and resilient future systems through various approaches of design research and interventions. And she's definitely a global pioneer in the emerging area of design for sustainability transitions. And she's developing theories, methods, tools for design practice dealing with sustainability transitions. I've been very lucky to collaborate and learn from Idil and apply her methods and theories in my design practice. And now today we will talk about what we can do about system innovation in this time. So we have about 58 people right now. Once again, if you have just joined later. And Mikael, thank you for sharing our Facebook groups and web page. For those of you who would like to become a member, we welcome you with open heart. We need people, community who wants to be active in the community and keep organizing this type of events. And lovely to see all the messages, some old colleagues, hello. So without further ado, I like to give the word to Idil. Sorry, one more thing I needed to say. Please mute your audios. When you are in the breakout rooms, you can put the videos on and then use the message to comment, and then we will have the Q&A after the talk. Okay, so I'll stop sharing now. And Idil, please go ahead.
So thank you, Zeynep, for the introduction, and hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining today's meetup. Hopefully, I will be able to ignite you. I'm going to start my timer so I don't overtalk, which, of course, academics do tend to overtalk. Hopefully, I will be able to ignite you. I'm not going to tell you or tell us how to achieve system innovations, because I think we're all in search of answers, but I am hoping to prompt some thoughts about how to go about transformative system innovation. I was saying I'm going to start with a little bit about my background so that you get an understanding of where I'm coming from, what's my perspective is coming from, what kind of lenses I am looking through in interpreting what I'm going to basically present. So I have an adventurous and quite interdisciplinary background. I'm an engineer, a designer, and a sustainability scientist. And my broad, I lived and worked, I have teaching, research, and consulting experience in 4 different countries across 2 hemispheres. And I moved to Finland in 2016 to take up my professorship. And my broad expertise is in system innovations and transitions for sustainability. And I'm particularly interested in transformative sustainability innovation in business and urban sustainability transitions. So in this work, I am tapping into and learning from and using several different theoretical frameworks, including systems theories, sustainability science, transitions research, and future studies and foresight. So in the past couple of years, political commitment to addressing climate change and sustainability issues have accelerated quite significantly. EU, of course, leading the way. What was I saying is we have seen political commitment becoming a little bit more significant and following, of course, EU's announcement of 55 emissions reduction by 2030. Also, China has declared that it's going to become carbon neutral in 2060. And Biden has put America back in Paris Agreement. These are important developments. So if we focus a little bit on EU launched the Green Deal and a total of 1 trillion euros will be mobilized over the following years. And the Green Deal also includes 150 billion euros for the associated just transitions mechanism. A climate law is in the making and a renewed circular economy action plan is published because the first one was evaluated to be quite successful. So arguably, we are at a political tipping point. On the other hand, if countries had acted 10 years ago, governments would have needed to reduce emissions by 3.3% each year. Today, we need to reduce emissions by 7.6% each year. And at the moment, even the most ambitious national climate action plans are far short of this requirement. And the world now needs a 5-fold increase in collective current commitments. The cuts required are ambitious, arguably still possible, but by just 2025, the cut needed will be 15.5% each year. This is from a UNEP report, making the 1.5 degrees Celsius target almost impossible. So we are not on track. And what is in 0.5 degree Celsius difference? So in 2018, IPCC published a special report looking at the implications of the 0.5 degrees Celsius difference between 1.5 between temperature increase being capped at 1.5 versus 2 degrees Celsius. So the summary for policymakers is incredibly interesting, and I would suggest you to read because there are multiple points on how significant that 0.5 degrees is across social and ecological systems. Just as an example, so poverty and disadvantage are expected to increase in some populations as global warming increases, and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees instead of 2 could reduce the number of people both exposed to climate related risks and susceptible to becoming poor by up to several hundred million by mid-century. So we this is IPCC 6. Essentially, it's published early August, very fresh. This is not the whole report, it's the report of the working group 1, which is about physical science. But there is nothing special about this report in the sense that there is nothing surprising in this report. The message is that we have to take mitigation action urgently, serious mitigation action urgently. So the report has 5 different emissions reduction scenarios, depending on how we may go with reducing the emissions. And essentially, here is the thing: global surface temperature will contribute to increase at least until the mid-century under all emission scenarios, and global warming of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. So not surprising, but underlining the urgency of emission reductions. On the other hand, we talk a lot about mitigation, but not so much about adaptation, and we really need to, because we really need to tackle and think about mitigation and adaptation together simultaneously, because some mitigation measures might be maladaptive, might actually hinder adaptation that's required. And unfortunately, departments in political organizations that deal with mitigation and adaptation are generally separate from one another. And this is also in research too, like mitigation researchers don't necessarily look at adaptation. So these 2 pieces of knowledge increasingly becoming quite important to link them, to think about them together. And there's quite a lot of uncertainty ahead of us in regards to how much we're going to be able to mitigate. And that, of course, has direct implication on what should we really adapt to in the coming decades and in this century. So my main message is we cannot achieve the needed deep structural changes without tackling the dysfunctions of the current political economic system, and solely through a technocentric systems innovation paradigm. So this brings me to the concept of deep leverage points. I am sure many of you listening to this now are very familiar with the concept of deep leverage points, and also many of you might know about the recently emerging discourse about deep leverage points. But for those who are not familiar with the deep leverage points and deep leverage points concepts, I'll just quickly kind of go over them. So the leverage points model was originally developed by Donella Meadows, who is also the lead author of Limits to Growth report years ago, systems modeler, essentially a scientist, quite important. And this leverage points model identifies 12 leverage points to change systems. And from top to bottom of the pyramid in this graphic, the potency of leverage points to change systems increases. The shallow leverage points are about parameters and feedbacks in systems, such as subsidies, standards, taxes, etc. Mostly quantifiable, measurable, things. And and also mechanistic things, and they're easier to intervene. Therefore, these leverage points are quite popular among policymakers because, producing evidence is easy for these points. But then the deep leverage points are about social structures, institutions, values, goals, and worldviews, all of these like soft things that are not easy to measure and not easy to also, provide consensus on, but quite significantly important to shape the emergent direction of systems. And these examples that are examples of items at deep leverage points cover criteria for success, how power is distributed, and perspectives on system purpose. So both research and practice in sustainability domain have primarily focused on the shallow leverage points. And this has resulted in society failing to leave unsustainable trajectories behind. So the argument is that we should intervene at deep leverage points. Okay, but easier said than done. So at the beginning or early phases of the pandemic, together with the members of my research group, we came together, of course, over Zoom to share what kind of weak signals we have been identifying in regards to the response to the pandemic, and what those the implications of those weak signals might be for sustainability transformations. For those who may not be familiar with foresight terminology, weak signals are emergent developments that may currently be small, but have significant strategic importance in how futures might unfold should they be amplified. So based on the weak signals that we identified, we developed categories of weak signals, and we developed a deep leverage points research agenda. I'm not going to share with you the research agenda or weak points themselves, but the categories of weak points. So we map them onto the deep leverage points to intent and design of systems. So next I'm going to walk you through these leverage points, or these weak signals that operate at the deep leverage points. So first is roles of national governments and attitudes towards democracy and transparency during complex systemic disruptions has been various, and still we are observing across the globe, quite different responses from national governments. And there's a lot to be learned from, what kind of interventions work in these kind of situations. But of course, what has become quite significant is the importance of national government's policy making and the pace of policy making. And then we have seen that, well, we are actually able to act really fast from a political point of view. Then we witnessed a rapid pace of adaptive political, technological, and scientific innovation across different levels of society. So during an emergency, innovation can actually happen quite fast, and unexpected collaborations may occur, some of which might be overriding the long-lasting institutions of society. So for example, in research, we've seen peer review process kind of being not overlooked, but kind of put aside a little bit as papers were being published, because we needed, even if it was not perfect knowledge. We needed to know what was going on as fast as possible. And then we gained broader visibility and increased awareness about structural inequalities. So this has a lot of relationship with the concept of justice, and of course, also directly and indirectly with climate and environmental justice. And these concepts are becoming increasingly more important in transitions discourse and also systems change discourse. Then vulnerabilities regarding production and consumption systems has become more viable, more visible, and awareness about them increased. And we are seeing businesses responding to this to a certain extent quite rapidly, because, well, in the end, you know, they have global supply chains, and this was like essentially a potential demo of expected disruptions in those supply chains, and this is immediately related to economic vulnerability of businesses. So we are seeing now everybody thinking about how to manage that risk. And we have been talking about risk of global supply chains for quite a while in relation to sustainability and climate change, but it needed a more kind of, I think, immediate crisis to be heard. And then there has been increased understanding of the shortcomings of the dominant neoliberal and global economic system in creating value for all and evaluating all value created in our societal systems. For example, frontline workers have created the most significant value during the pandemic, although they are, very much so underpaid part of the population. And this is a little bit analogous to our production consumption systems and where value is created and who gets paid most. And then quite important concept, self-organization. So we also activated self-organized responses, and we appreciated more the benefits of mechanisms of self-organization in response to crisis. So because self-organization is a double-edged sword when it comes to crisis response, we will need to really understand how self-organization happens in communities, and we will need to create policies that is going to assist self-organized communities to effectively work. Very, very important. Then there has been increased realization of the interconnectedness of ecosystems and social systems. We all appreciated, at least, I mean, in Finland, we all appreciated having urban green space and felt very lucky about living in Helsinki. I did, at least, when my friends in places like Istanbul were being essentially not able to leave their homes, not because it wasn't allowed, but because there wasn't anywhere for them to go to get a fresh breath. And then we also increased our realization that human capacity and legitimacy to dominate nature is limited. A virus essentially kept us indoors for extended periods of times, and pandemics are not created by viruses per se, but because human systems mess with ecosystems, ecological systems. Then also related to that, there has been growing emphasis on the importance of nature for psychological well-being and social and climatic resilience. almost last but not least, greater awareness of race, age, ability, and gender-based inequalities, and increasing desire to address systematic, normalized, invisible, and built-in prejudices and discrimination has been observed, particularly amplified with the Black Lives Matter, and followed by, movements of, for example, queer, climate justice, etc. And then in some instances, we have seen prioritization of human and societal well-being over economic gain, in innovation. So these are incredibly important categories of weak signals, and you can read the examples if you're interested in the examples, but I'm sure you have also observed the examples of all of these categories. You can read our paper, but my kind of question at the moment, are these going to be scaled up? Will we be able to remember the learnings and kind of scale them up and implement them to climate change related responses, both in mitigation and adaptation, or are they just going to, dissolve when we are back into our kind of post-normal normal? Now I would like to move to a multi-level innovation framework that we developed together with a colleague of mine who has been in design for sustainability field for as long as I have been. And this book is published in 2020 and it's open access. So if you either search for the name or scan the barcode, the Q code, you can access the PDF. So in this book, we looked at how responses to social and environmental problems have evolved over time, and what kind of approaches have been developed. And we have talked about those approaches, which I'm not going to talk about today, but we have identified 6 levels of innovation. So as you can see, it's quite obvious that from bottom to top, you are moving from kind of small scale, micro scale interventions at material and component level to increasingly more complex systemic levels. And I'm particularly interested in, of course, sustainable transformations. Here at the moment, we observe that when we talk about system innovations, we at most talk about socio-technical system innovations, and some of which are quite significant. On the other hand, the way that we try to kind of push them forward is more often than not is incrementalist rather than transformative. And then, of course, we really need to actually kind of understand and rethink the relationships between socio-technical and ecological systems. So that's the kind of uppermost level of systemic innovations. And let me change my slide. So predominantly, and unfortunately still, in industry response, business response is at this low-hanging fruits level. And policies also support increasingly more, of course. These levels have been quite kind of activated in the past 20, 30 years, but increasingly more policies are, supporting innovations at these levels. for businesses to take action. And these cover, industry standards, EU and national legislation, and also, of course, supply chain vulnerabilities make businesses to kind of think about the materials and components as well as the products that they're developing. But this is the kind of, it's the realm of sustainability as usual. Now, everybody is doing sustainability these days, and we really need to move to beyond sustainability as usual when we talk about systems innovations, and particularly for kind of like the uppermost level, and also actually socio-technical system innovations. We need new imaginaries, kind of quite bold policy foresight, and lots of mini experimentation to create the evidence for transformative policies before, we kind of roll out these things at larger scales. And these imply quite new partnerships, new collaboration models, and really rethinking, what business means in society, what kind of organizational models are either complementing or replacing certain business models. And then, how can we activate communities and living environments so that they become adaptive, because adaptation is going to happen at hyper local level, etc. So this is the realm of beyond sustainability as usual. And we really need to move system innovation efforts to this beyond sustainability as usual realm. And systems innovations are not necessarily transformative. I would argue that majority of systems innovation initiatives, policies at the moment are incrementalist. And I would like to kind of give an example so that maybe it becomes a little bit clearer what I mean. And of course, my example will come from circular economy, super hot topic, and lots of kind of policy push and funding mechanisms supporting transitions to circular economy, etc. So these two photos are from 2017 and 2 days apart from one another. This was the first World Circular Economy Forum, because Finland has this vision of being number one of circular economy in the world. It was held in Finlandia Hall. I was there, I participated, and I actually was incredibly disappointed with the lack of imagination there. There was a lot of corporate business presenting their, new washing machines or etc. with improved recyclability, etc. My designer side was just crying because of the lack of imagination. My researcher side was saying, oh, yes, so finally 20 years after industry started to close loops, wonderful. And on the right-hand side, this happened in Teurastamo, Open Circular Economy Days, totally bottom-up organized event. And it was happening, I think, every year until the pandemic. So this is essentially, displaying niche innovations around circular economy, what communities are thinking about, how we can make our lives circular, sustainable, etc. And community and small businesses were present in this, local businesses were present in this event. And funnily, no interaction was happening between these two, and actors in either event were not aware of the other event happening. So in my opinion, this is a hugely missed opportunity, particularly from the point of view of transitions, where you really need to kind of support the niche innovations in order to challenge and transform the mainstream. I found this to be to be a hugely missed opportunity. And this is not only in circular economy. We see this in relation to all of the sustainability related innovation activities. There is the mainstream and the official, and the one that gets a lot of publicity because they happen with a lot of funding, and then there are the community events that actually display very different ways of doing things. So this was just an example of what I mean by current system innovations are incrementalist. Then I'm going to now finish and hopefully leave you with some threads that you can pull and reflect, and with a thought that I think is quite important. So visions, we need visions of alternative futures, because they can open up new conversations and assist with breaking from the existing perceptions of possibilities that underpin planning and design decisions. And the process of generating visions and the visions themselves can be considered as a feedback loop, because they highlight tensions, portray existing practices that are seeds of alternative futures, and make potential new areas for innovation visible. And on that note, I will say that critical and normative foresight should go hand in hand with systemic thinking. Foresight, specifically critical and normative foresight, is fundamental knowledges if we want to move beyond incremental approaches to systems innovation. Because as systems practitioners, we need to know where we want to go to redirect our practice and to intervene in myriad systems that we are embedded in as professionals, as individuals, as educators, as policymakers, etc. And that's the end of my talk, and thank you for your patience. And once again, sorry about the kind of incompatibility or misbehavior of my Zoom. That's it.
Thank you, Edith, for the brilliant talk. I'm sure everybody here is really inspired and excited. We can see hands and claps if you like to give some feedback. And yeah, we want to give this moment actually to have a little bit interaction. And please, either you can write your questions on the chat, or you can just raise hands and then I can give you a space to ask your question directly. So I'm reading here. Thank you, and inspired and great. And
I don't see a hand, but can I see a hand from here?
Okay. Yeah.
It's Tero Kaihlavirta.
Okay, go ahead, Tero.
So I asked my written question to Idil vocally. So how about changing buildings from energy consumption emission sources to burn-free renewable energy small-scale power plants? I think that it would be democratic and socially justified way to produce energy, and it would cut emissions enormously, for example, in Finland.
Thank you for that question. So I'm going to start my answer by saying that I am not an energy expert. But of course, distributed energy systems has been on the agenda for quite a while. And indeed, renewable energy technologies make it possible to have distributed energy systems, which are also more resilient, because you're not relying on a single grid across the whole country, and you can deal with power cutoffs, etc., more easily. So we looked into this. I don't know much about Finland and who is doing distributed energy related work. I know people who are doing energy transitions related work. But in Australia, we looked into distributed energy, and for Australian context, what was at the time, what was evident was that in Australia, I mean, of course, there's first of all quite significant deployment of solar panels, and there's enormous amount of sunny days. So it's quite, in a way, ideal. But for cities, it was found to be, at least in the short term, not quite viable, because the grid was providing what was needed, and it was recently kind of renovated, etc. On the other hand, the general kind of consensus among energy transition experts was that distributed energy systems would be quite critical and important for outside of city areas, for rural areas. So I can imagine a similar situation in Finland as well, but again, underlining, I'm, not an energy expert. However, distributed energy systems, I think, are going to be part of the solution, and they're going to be very important.
Great, thank you. There's also a couple of community comments in the chat. Tero, you can also check those out. But there's one question from Lena I want to ask you now. How do you see the degrowth movement contributing to alternative visions of the future?
Thank you so much for that question. So one thing that I kind of planned to talk about, but then couldn't really squeeze into my talk, was the question about growth. So I think our lexicon, language is very important in how we build our, worldview, and also how we understand the world. And I'm a little bit saddened to see, the phrase sustainable growth appearing in otherwise quite ambitious new strategies of companies, research organizations, universities, etc. Because it's essentially an oxymoron. There's no such thing as sustainable growth, and we cannot grow indefinitely in a finite planet. This has been established decades ago, although, of course, the discussion on growth, when to and where, is a quite heated scientific discussion, and it's ongoing. And when it comes to degrowth being or contributing into these alternative visions, definitely. Not only in Finland, but across the world, degrowth communities are contributing into thinking and doing of alternative lifestyles quite significantly. And in Notice, we have an expert, a postdoctoral researcher, Eva Houtbeckers. She is studying degrowth and degrowth communities, as well as she's part of those communities. My personal professional kind of observation is that there is a general tendency in not only in degrowth communities, but any community who or which is actually doing things quite significantly differently and contributing into, alternative futures. Those communities are not, it's a political choice, and I respect that. And they're not taking, the institution seriously. They're not engaging with the mainstream, policy-making processes, etc., because I think they do think, and maybe they're right, that it is futile. On the other hand, from a systems change point of view, empirically supported theories tell us that there needs to be, some interaction between these new imaginaries and the mainstream political processes. I understand that it's a both ways thing, of course, because mainstream political processes are not engaging these alternative imaginaries, but I kind of would like to see a bit more interaction between the mainstream and the alternatives. Long answer to a very short question, because I think it's a very important question, and thank you for asking that.
Great. So I will pick a couple of more questions here, and one is from Tuba. She's asking, do you see a clear distinction between system change and system innovation?
It's a good question, and I mean, I guess many different people can respond to this question differently, but for me, systems innovation is a specific term coming from system innovations and transitions theories, and it is about innovation systems and how sectors transform, etc. Whereas systems change is, it's a term that is about. I mean, it's a generic term about about any system kind of transforming. So in a way, they're related because system innovations theories are based on, to a certain extent, on systems theories, in a way like basic theories. They're not necessarily the same thing, because systems change is not necessarily about innovation systems or socio-technical systems or socio-technical ecological systems. It's a much more generic term in my understanding, whereas system innovation is specific to socio-technical / socio-technical ecological systems.
Thank you. Next, I will ask Dora's question. Would financial transparency, social business, etc., help with these efforts, since we know that those with more disposable income contribute more to carbon emission?
Sorry, can you repeat that again? I was reading another question in the chat, so I got distracted.
Okay, so about the financial transparency, what's the role of that in these efforts? And basically the people with more disposable income contribute more to CO2 emissions, and how that can be actually utilized, leverage.
Well, again, I mean, money or financial topics are, not in my expertise, but I do think that transparency is important in terms of justice and equality. And there are actually some companies where everybody's salaries are transparent, and you can see, how much your CEO is earning and how many folds of your own salary a CEO's salary is. But on the other hand, the companies that do this have taken actually significant, measures so that the CEOs are not earning 100 times of the kind of least paid employee in those companies. But also in terms of, this also touches to gender equality. And as much as Finland is among, the better countries when it comes for, for a working woman, there is still significant discrepancies between salaries of men and women doing the same job. And unless we are, transparent about these things, and we start to become comfortable talking about these things, we are, it's not going to be easy to tackle inequality, because people will not necessarily give power away unless they're asked to or they're required. So, generally high paid people don't want to disclose, they don't do voluntary disclosures. Or like, you know, in my work, there is a network of academics. We do disclose our salaries voluntarily to one another. But I would have loved if my university actually had a transparency policy so that we could see how equal or not, you know, we are. So my answer to that part of the question is that. And then when it comes to disposable income, well, indeed, and disposable income is predominantly accumulated in the West, which is doing overconsumption. I'm not really sure how to tackle the disposable income, you know, question, but of course, I think very interesting discussions, and they have been going on for many years on reducing the working week. So now I am seeing some companies in Finland kind of, you know, reducing their employees' work days to 4, but they pay the same salary. So that's not the idea. That's an idea that is, you know, completely kind of, from a sustainability point of view, completely misguided. The idea of a shorter working week is not that people have more time to spend the disposable income that they have on things that they don't need, but it's about they're going to also earn less. And then in their free time, they are going to do things that are not associated with consumption of resources, but about enrichment of, you know, relationships and communities, or relationship with nature, or etc. Those kind of things that actually add value to our systems. So that's my answer to that.
This is a great answer, Edith. Thank you so much. Yiri asked a very nice question. How do you see the setting between networks and hierarchies in systems change? Tough questions, but
it's a very tough question. Also, to me, it's a little bit of an unclear question. I wonder if Yiri would like to open that up a little bit. What do you mean when you see, how do you see the setting between? Are you asking the relationship between networks and hierarchies, or do you know, are you asking whether, yeah, you go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, if you can hear me now. Well, it's not 100% sharp to me, but as in your presentation, you had the circular economy happening, and the disconnect between the official and the grassroots. Of course, we can think that the official somehow got organized in a more hierarchical setting. Of course, there are networks between the public policymakers and so on. But the kind of first take is that when you have grassroots development, it's more organic, more the change and the information is forming more in the networks, and in thinking of how the public or private and public-private business as usual, politics as usual, administration as usual processes, which are very much top-down and hierarchic, how they could be opened up to more responsive processes. In that setting, we are still in the basic hierarchies and the basic organizational processes, and my kind of thinking or hunch here, or vague understanding is that the one thing that hinders the kind of more fruitful cooperation between grassroots and the let's say politics or our business as usual is that the kind of more networked processes do not tend to fit so well into the kind of more hierarchical processes? Was that even more vague?
Yeah, it had multiple layers. But I think, I mean, in relation to the, old schoolness of our governance systems, I am not the right person, but you should listen to Marco Steinberg. I think he has a lot of amazing stuff to tell, and he is doing great stuff. His work is about that. So also, I mean, grassroots is not necessarily any less hierarchical or bureaucratic than official or top-down mechanisms. There are several grassroots organizations. I mean, for example, Greenpeace is an incredibly hierarchical organization. So I would also like to challenge the assumption that grassroots are more organic and more democratic and etc. Well, not necessarily. I also personally think that, I mean, of course, needless to talk about power of networks. Benkler has already done that. I don't need to do that. On the other hand, I am a little bit confused about how to really, how to steer large systemic transformations in democratic settings where everybody's voices are heard and processes are democratic and consensual and etc. It's, I think, if maybe one of the reasons we are kind of stagnating is because we're trying to do exactly that. But should we not do that? Well, absolutely, of course, the answer to that question is no. But I don't think we have a good formula. I think Indy Johar has been working on this topic, like our democratic institutions are not suitable, but what to replace them with is also a question of transitions work.
Thanks. Could you repeat the last name you said? Who was
Indy Johar.
We can write in the chat. There is great work from them. Hey, I want to move to the next question. Mikael was asking, how can design help transform Meetups' second highest leverage point, mindset or paradigm that the system arises from?
Well, it's a very good question, and arguably, design has been doing that for its entire existence, not necessarily in the way that we understand or not necessarily in relation to sustainability, but because through processes of design, if we, when we are not so occupied with menial incremental innovations of salt and pepper shakers, we are actually imagining and creating exactly mindset changing innovations. So how can we do that? Well, we can look at historical examples, but we need to kind of frame, what those examples are and study them. But if I come to kind of like my present work at the moment, creation of new imaginaries, and I'm not saying that it's only designers who are creating or capable to create. And actually, I mean, let's not also generalize, majority of the designers are still, predominantly working for the, the consumption society. But those who are involved in creation of imaginaries, I think are assisting, with that. But I also don't think deeper leverage points are points that can be successfully intervened with one professional group. They require, they essentially require collaboration, because we don't have, no single profession or no single knowledge body is enough to activate those leverage points.
Thank you.
Maybe design is a form of autopoiesis, maybe, Mikhail. Let's write an article on this.
I'd like to ask another question from Maria. Do you have any examples of existing companies with business models that are based on balancing feedback loops instead of reinforcing growth only? I'm especially interested in transportation, but example of any field would be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, well, not to the extent that would satisfy me. But I mean, if we talk about balancing feedback loops, Interface did that years and years and years ago when they set the zero waste vision, and they moved from linear production consumption models to actually totally cyclic models before Ellen MacArthur reinvented circular economy. Anyway. So they basically worked with feedback loops in that, but I know that you're not asking the question in that sense. Let me kind of quickly search my internal database, and well, I mean, not really. I am not sure what would be the like observational, aspects in a business of them considering feedback loops, because as far as my understanding goes, businesses don't necessarily think in systems. But one business example that actually have successfully built a business in alignment with their vision and continuing to learn from what they've done and put it back into their practice is Nolla. For example, I'm talking about the zero food waste restaurant Nolla. So certain things that they've done, I think, is quite remarkable, given that they're a very small team and they're super busy cooking and making food, but they have managed to, find particular, not loopholes, but kind of, I'm now trying to remember the story. Probably I will remember it incorrectly, but essentially Nolla has a genuine policy for zero waste. So they want to also their suppliers to, abide by that. But then the policy apparently said that if you're buying fish, it needs to come in a polystyrene, thing, and then that needs to be thrown away. And Nolla was not satisfied with that, and they wanted to find a solution. And they kind of talked with the policy enforcer, etc., and then they read the policy themselves and find out that it's not actually about the polystyrene cup, but there needs to be, I think, a particular kind of sheet underneath the fish. So they figured that out. And why is this important? I think this exemplifies how a business can actually disrupt a feedback loop, because there's that feedback loop of policy, misunderstanding of policy by the policy enforcer, and enforcing that policy over and over again, which results in unnecessarily disposed large quantities of polystyrene food packaging. So by way of kind of not giving up and finding the policy and understanding it, and then discussing, that with the policymaker, they have basically disrupted that kind of negative feedback loop, negative in the sense that undesirable. I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but
I feel this is a great example, and I think having not enough concrete examples is one of the pain points in my heart as well. So I would like to ask community, because we have people from many countries here, if you know this type of good cases, feel free to share in the message. I've seen already couple of links. So it would be really interesting to share those examples, because more concrete, we can describe this type of concepts. I think it's better to be understood by a larger group of people as well.
And also, I mean, there are businesses who are thinking with regenerative, with the logic of regeneration. And that's very interesting. I am not sure if anyone has achieved, 100% regenerative business, because this is not something that a single business can achieve on its own, because it is a systemic transformation. But I know that some businesses are quite deeply thinking about, how can we become a regenerative business?
Patagonia became the apple of sustainability examples. So yeah, I think that's clear, but let's find more so that there's a bit more diverse. I want to move to the maybe last question, if I don't miss anything, from Marco. How do we build representation of many different groups, the genders and sectors of society when building shared futures?
Well, $1 million question. So this question, I love this question because it is asked and I give the same answer. First of all, as an ideal, of course, representation in future making is quite important. On the other hand, when it comes to practice, there are decision-making points about when is a good time to do this, when is a good time to, who would be a good representative from each of those groups who are also able to imagine alternative futures. It requires a lot of curation. It requires a lot of networking and being very aware of, if you are the person who makes selection of those people, or whomever is, inviting those people, that person has power over. So also that person needs to be, self-reflective on how might I be doing a good job or a bad job. But it's quite an important question. On the other hand, it's not an easy question to answer, because essentially not everyone is able to imagine alternative, plausible futures. So, there are critical moments when these engagements should happen, and generally at the pre-transition phases, when these imaginaries are just kind of developing, they are kept in closed elite circles, and I have criticized this in one of my recent articles. But yeah, I mean, when is a good time, and how, in what ways that representation would be actually effective and beneficial for imagining alternative futures?
Thank you. Yeah, maybe there's last question from Dora. Okay, I will not read that, but what is the role of local municipalities?
It depends on it depends on who your local municipality officers are. I mean, the role of local municipalities could be incredibly important in, certain political settings. For example, in Australia, when we started Visions and Pathways project for developing vision scenarios and pathways for post-transition futures in Australian cities, 3 months after the kickoff of that project, Australia elected Tony Abbott, who is a climate denier, and who actually essentially told all of the governmental officers that you're not going to put climate change in any reports, you're banned from doing that, etc. So quite major change in the political kind of setting happened. But Australia is a tiered federal, has a tiered federal governance system. So that kind of means local municipalities can act or enact policies that are very different than the federal government. So despite the federal government's rather strict kind of banning of anything climate change, we worked very fruitfully with Melbourne City, because Melbourne City was governed by, I think, Labour Party. And so in that case, it was, it was super important, the role of the local municipality. And also we are seeing, and this has been happening for almost a decade now, because national governments have not really been able to kind of agree on terms and conditions and take action and etc. On the other hand, the impact of climate change is observed, felt very much so in the cities. There are, global city alliances as well as European city alliances, like Compact of Mayors, ICLEI, etc. So cities, kind of coming together and let's do this together, let's learn from one another, etc. So I think local municipalities can be super important. Yeah.
Okay, excellent ending to a really excellent talk and event. And I really appreciate all of you staying 20 minutes extra for this event than planned. So thank you so much. And I'm sure Edith would be happy to hear from you directly if you have any questions and ideas later. And I look forward to meet you again in this event.
Thank you, Zeynep, and thank you everyone for joining in.